Hello and welcome to this video in which we are going to analyze some of the movements of the technique of Robert Guthrie. Now I'm making this video with a heavy heart because Mr. Guthrie has been my guitar teacher for the past 10 years or so. He's without a doubt the most incredible musician, the most brilliant mind that I've ever been around and ever had the pleasure of knowing. And he passed away just a few months ago. He was 79 years old, which isn't, exactly young, but, he passed rather unexpectedly. I don't think anybody really saw it coming. So, he did get to see a few of these technique analysis videos that I made, and he was a really big fan. He said that he just loved them and watched them over and over and thought they were really great. So I'm doing a lot of things now to try and honor his spirit and to continue on his work, and this just seems like one of those things. Now, if you've never heard of Robert Guthrie, that's okay, because he really did not make a habit out of promoting himself. It was just not something that he, as far as I could tell, and for as long as I knew him, ever expressed any interest in. He was very interested in playing the guitar, studying music, and working with people, and wanting to know what other people thought about things, and just staying extremely interested. I have linked in the description below a playlist that contains all of the recordings that we have of him, which is not a ton, but it is a decent amount. So if you enjoy classical guitar, if you're into it, and you've never heard him play the guitar, then I would definitely say go check out these recordings. You will not regret it. He plays very traditional repertoire for the most part. There are a handful of albums in there. There are a couple of concert performances, including the last concert that he ever played. And there are a couple of TV performances. So the TV performances, just a few of them, that's where I got this video footage. And that's where we really have the opportunity to look at a couple of his movements and kind of study what may be going on here. And this is going to be a little bit different in terms of these technique analysis videos because I knew him and I remember the things that he said. So, some of the other videos that I've made, I don't know those people personally, so I don't try and guess really about here's what they're going for, because I have no idea. You might just speculate about an advantage that they may get by doing something, or just outright find it interesting, something like that. But some of these things I definitely think are intertwined with Mr. Guthrie's teaching. So that's kind of unavoidable. So a few of the things I picked out, I looked for, and when I found instances of him doing them, I thought, yes, this was really important. He did this all the time. He talked about it. So it's going to be intertwined a little bit differently than some of the other videos that are just merely based on observation. So I start out many of these videos by looking at somebody's basic general free stroke hand position, because so many styles of guitar are going to use free stroke in some kind of way, right? So that's what we have here. And what stands out to me about Mr. Guthrie's right hand and his free stroke position and what he talked about is his thumb. He would sometimes talk about his long thumbs. and it's not that he had really, really long fingers. I mean, his fingers had nice length to them, but it's not like they were the longest fingers in the world. But his thumb was longer, relative to his other fingers than normal. So he did have long thumbs. And one of the things that he would always teach and make sure that people knew about, he actually learned from flamenco, and it was thumb position, where you have a very elevated wrist. He would say, if you were to elevate it anymore, it would be hyperextended. That's how tall your wrist should be for thumb position. And it just taught your hand so much strength and power to draw from, even when you're not in that exclusive position. You can feel how advantageous it is to have your thumb be so strong. So what stuck out to me and what I remember seeing, sitting in front of him is, he played with a pretty highly elevated wrist most all the time. I mean, he was a student of Andres Segovia, so, this was definitely the style, after Segovia. And I think what he's drawing from is just an insanely powerful thumb. I think you can see with all these thumb strokes, he would talk about using the thumb, from the joint kind of back where it connects to your wrist. And it looks like at this angle, he's getting a whole lot of that while he's doing arpeggios and, a few alternating notes and all kinds of things. It all comes from this extremely strong hand position based on the elevated wrist and the angle of the thumb. And just as comparison, in my own playing, my wrist generally is not this tall. I think part of it is your anatomy. It's not as comfortable for me to have this much of an elevated wrist all the time, unless I'm doing something like thumb position and I'm just taking the fingers totally out of it. But I think it's really amazing, one that, he found this position that he obviously just felt this is the best, most strong position from which to come from when I'm doing general playing, and that, it was so comfortable for him. And I'm kind of envious of people like him who can have such a tall wrist and, it never gives them any issues or any discomfort or anything like that. So really just a display of power here, I think, is what you're seeing. And from this other angle, I just thought this was interesting because you can really see the height of the elevation. And this really reminds me of Segovia. It's not like Segovia played like this 100% of the time, but a lot of the time he certainly did. A very tall wrist, just kind of like limp hand hanging down. And from that position, he was able to do everything. So I love the angles caught here by the guys who did this documentary. I think they did an amazing job. I always have frustration when I see a great player being filmed and I feel like, they don't do a good job of capturing their hands and kind of experimenting at least with different ways to capture them. And so I think this angle is really neat to, show what we're talking about here. And you can see just the height in his wrist. And for him, I think this supplied so much power for his technique. And just for contrast, it's not like he played with an elevated wrist 100% of the time. I feel like by the time I got into his program, he was not using that position quite as much as he was during this time, because I remember seeing his hand do more of these types of things. So there was one shot in the footage, in all the footage of both the documentaries, where he flattens out his wrist and really changes hand position dramatically. And there are many players that play like this exclusively, like this is their normal free stroke position. But, Mr. Guthrie only believed in rules so much so as, he needed them to play music. And if they weren't going to help what he wanted to do, then he would throw them away in a second. So when he is trying to draw from the advantages of the elevated wrist, like maybe having the thumb be super advantageous, he does not stray from that position. But then in a shot like this, when he needs to go for a different sound, when he's after something different, well, he will change his hand position in a second, and he'll just do whatever he needs to do. So this kind of caught my eye when I found it. It's the only shot where he goes to this obvious flatter hand position because he's obviously going after something different. So the next thing that I want to talk about is about his other long thumb, about his left hand long thumb. And I never realized this, in all the lessons I had with him. Maybe you need an angle like this to see it, but it really struck me how, first of all, his left hand thumb, a lot of the time, it sticks out above the fingerboard. You just don't see this a whole lot. It seems like so much more often I hear people say things like, well, you keep it in the back of the neck, or the middle of the neck, or even, further down or to the side. But having it stick up, well, I just don't really hear about that. And because, he would talk about his long thumbs, one of the things I notice here is that he is not only sticking his thumb up above the fingerboard, he's also bending the tip joint. So it's not like he's only bracing with the thumb or using it for counter pressure. He is literally moving his tip joint only in certain instances. And when I saw this, it really blew my mind, because I just thought, well, you look at someone's left hand, or, their fretboard hand, and you think, well, I can see everything that's going on. But in this case, only with this shot where you can kind of see the back and what the thumb is doing, you can see him specifically bending the tip joint of his thumb to get in and out of certain positions. And then, kind of like we talked about with the plucking hand, some of the stuff going on there, when he needs the advantage of a certain position, well, he will stay right there. But as soon as he needs a different position, he will jump right, all the way into that position, and it'll be very different, and then he will go back, whenever he needs to. So this was probably the most interesting thing to me that I saw, that I never realized. I did hear him talk a few times about squeezing with the fretboard hand thumb. He said that definitely happens. He says it's not like it's a constant thing. It's like a feel thing, but he says I definitely do feel that squeeze to help, with certain bar chords or things like that. But I had no idea kind of the agility of the tip joint of his thumb and how he utilizes it in particular. So not only can you see him, squeezing with the tip joint, or the tip joint slightly bending when his thumb is sticking out kind of above the fingerboard, but you can also see when he brings the thumb down, still at times, not all the time, but at certain times, he will bend the tip joint to get in and out of certain positions. This next little thing, I call it like a little trick, because some people never ever do this, but some people make it like a staple of their technique. Carlos Barbosa Lima is someone that comes to mind who I remember seeing him do this a lot. So in this little clip, Mr. Guthrie, he bends the tip joint of his first finger and uses that bend as kind of like a mini bar to fret, the same fret on two different strings. And it's just like a little trick. It's totally a breaking of a rule. If you watch all the other footage of this video, I imagine you will not see one single tip joint knuckle ever collapse like this. This is a very intentional move where he's doing this fingering in particular, and I imagine it's certainly by this point that this never happened unless he, commanded it to happen. But this is a rule that some players just will never break. They just don't ever want to say that, they're gonna let the tip joints collapse. But this is something that he would utilize somewhat frequently. I can think of multiple spots in the pieces that he wrote where you have to utilize the bending of this tip joint of the first finger, and if you can't do that fingering, then the fingering becomes incredibly complicated. Basically, too complicated. So you're thinking, well, what the heck is he doing? Well, if you just utilize this little bend in your tip joint finger, it's like, oh, well, that's all that it is. It's kind of a different type of move. But I just wanted to point it out because it's just a little thing that he would do, here and there. And he used to joke about the guitar police. And he would say, don't break too many rules or the guitar police is going to find you. And it was just kind of his way of, joking about the rules, saying, yeah, they will help you until you need to do something different, and then they won't help you. You need to kind of adhere to a different set of rules. So when I saw this little trick, I thought, yeah, I certainly remember him doing that, and I know of a few other spots and pieces where he wrote where, that little trick, it comes in handy for sure. So the next thing I want to look at here is his hand position for playing fast scales. Now, Mr. Guthrie was just beyond interested in scales. He only had about 15 different scale techniques that were all just, operating on a masterful level. So, when he played a scale passage in a piece, he had a lot of options to choose from. So it was very interesting for me to see, like, when he plays this scale from this performance decades ago, what technique is he going to use? 2-finger, 3-finger, free stroke, rest stroke, IM, IA, or with thumb, or whatever, what's going to happen. And it looks like this is from, I think all of these scales are from the performance that he did here of the cadenza from the Villalobos Guitar Concerto. Those were the only spots where the camera was on his right hand during a scale. And to me, the scale technique he's using here looks like IM free stroke. I can't be 100% sure. Let me know if you feel like you see something different. Definitely with some rest strokes thrown in, maybe at the beginning or the end, but it looks like IM free stroke. But what's interesting to me is his thumb. So I've talked about people's thumbs before because I'm kind of fascinated by this. Some people do this thumb curling thing when they play fast scales. And I don't really understand how that works, but I just know, I see people do it. It's like some people are like a thumb curler and some people aren't. But Mr. Guthrie, it looks like he was a slight thumb curler. And I do remember, sitting in front of him and, kind of seeing him play scales and kick into hyperspeed, and his thumb would do this little thing. So it's not super severe like, Paco de Lucia or somebody like that. But you do see the tip joint bending in towards the palm, and it just, as he goes down the strings, it just kind of has this little wiggle. And that's something that I certainly remember seeing him do. Another thing that sticks out to me, no pun intended, about his scale hand position is the pinky. And I've also talked about this in other videos because I'm pretty fascinated by it. So some people, when they play scales, they're pinky people. They stick their pinky out. And it looks like, Mr. Guthrie was also one of these people. Here in this shot, I think you can really see it clearly where, it's like his M and I fingers are obviously going in. His A finger is sympathetic, so it's staying in. I mean, it's not sticking out, right? But his pinky is sticking out. There's the pinky. And not to an extreme degree. I've seen people just flat out, like, throw their pinky in the air as far as it will go before they even play a scale. So this is not to that degree, but it looks like he was also a pinky scale person. Somehow using that side of the hand for, I don't know, some extra strength or some balance or something like that. And in this passage here, he's playing, it's Villalobos Prelude 2, and he's playing that ascending super legato scale run that I think you're supposed to do with slurs, and he does it with the slurs. So he's not like playing a rapid succession of notes with the plucking hand, but it is kind of, it's like a similar technique, right? Just kind of in slower motion. But you can see here his pinky sticking out. So it kind of comes out for a second. So he's utilizing something there with the scale technique. And then once I started looking for it, I found this passage where it looks like, so this is a Saints de la Mesa piece. And this is a very busy right hand passage, a lot of arpeggios and with some chords. And it looks like with some of the chords, he actually throws the pinky out. That was really interesting. I don't think he's using it to pluck, but it comes out right before he plucks the chord. And I only remember seeing this in this one instance. And then a little bit later on, he switches to some alternating, and here comes the pinky. And it kind of sticks out. So this next set of clips are all of Mr. Guthrie doing a big full thumb stroke with all flesh of the thumb. And this is something that I was glad to find. This is the performance that he did for TV in Mexico. And he actually has a funny story about this performance, because the person that was driving him to the event, they were running late, and they actually got there late. So he said when he got there, they told him, we've stalled, but you're going on in literally 5 minutes. So he just had time to tune his guitar, and then he's going and playing on TV. No warm-ups, nothing. Here you go. And you can listen to this performance again. It's linked in the description, and see how it turned out. You never would have guessed that he didn't even get to warm up. But this is from he plays a Roncalli set in this performance, and there's a section in one of these pieces where there's a lot of strumming, and I thought about doing this section on the different strumming techniques he used, because he uses a lot here, but I wanted to focus on the all-flesh thumb stroke technique, because if I had to pick one of the pillars of his approach to the guitar, it would be this technique. So I'll describe it best I can, although I won't claim to completely understand it. So he would stick his thumb out. He would describe it as thumbprint. So he would put his thumbprint on the strings. He would flatten out his hand, and then he would just push his hand down, push the flesh of his thumb through all the strings. And I remember first trying to learn this technique from him, and it just felt like the hardest thing in the world to control. And still to this day, when I see someone execute this in the middle of a piece and it sounds really wonderful, I'm just really impressed. I mean, if you play the guitar with nails and then you suddenly make this really full, all-flesh sound, it sticks out as being very different. It can be very effective, and it's just not... I just don't think it's a very easy thing to do. Mr. Guthrie would throw this in many instances of his playing. And in this Roncalli piece, I mean, he does this technique over and over and over for this section of the piece. But it's not that it just makes, a nice effect in the music that he's playing. In my opinion, this was one of the things that he did that just made his guitars sound like cannons. You could pick if you were blindfolded, you could pick one of his guitars out of a lineup. If you were blindfolded and people were handing you guitars and you're playing like, yeah, this one, okay, yeah, this one, yeah. And then it's like, oh, this is one of his guitars. Because this guitar sounds like whoever plays it just beats the hell out of it. And it is so much more riled up than the other guitars. And, from time to time in lessons, you trade guitars and play on each other's guitars. Or one time I traded guitars with him for a few months, and I just was always blown away as soon as I kind of learned to recognize it at how amazing his guitars sounded. They just sounded like they were firing on more cylinders than I knew were possible. And so I would ask him about this, and I never really got a clear answer. Sometimes people, they just don't want to talk about things. I don't know if it was that. Or, Mr. Guthrie kind of had the attitude a lot of the times of like, well, doesn't everyone know this? He was a very humble guy. So he also may have just been thinking, well, what, just make your guitar sound like this. When I'm just thinking like, well, I have no idea how. I want to, but it's like a mystery to me. So the only thing that I ever heard him say about making his guitars sound so loud and so full and just so riled up was that he would do this flesh-only thumb stroke a lot. He said, sometimes, when I'm warming up, I'll just sit there and do this stroke, as loud as I can over and over for, 5 or 10 minutes. So when you do that, you're just constantly pounding the guitar. You're just pounding the top of it. And he said, I'll do it and I'll time it so that right when the guitar is hit with that force of energy, right when it might think it's going to get to kind of rebound, I hit it again, and I hit it again, and I hit it again He kind of had a system for strategically beating the crap out of his guitars. But, if you know about traditional classical guitars, then you know that they like that. I mean, they want to throw that back at you. They want to handle it. They have their preferences, but it's fun for them. It's being alive for them. So it's not beating up in a sadistic way. It's beating up in like come out and play kind of way. But I wanted to point this out because he definitely did use it in music. Some of these strokes are softer. Some of them are louder. There's a couple of passages where he does kind of some strums, like a few in a row. But I wanted to point it out and talk about what it looks like visually, and as much as I can recall him talking about it and the effects that it had, because it definitely was one of these staples of his technique. And I think his sound was so full and so rich, and I believe a lot of that was based on the way that he would beat his guitars up in utilizing this all flesh, very powerful thumb stroke. So, that's all that we're going to talk about here today as far as technique. Now, I have one bonus thing for you. So, I just think this is really funny. And so, if you happen to ever be one of his students, you probably will as well, because you will know exactly what I'm about to show feels like, because I certainly do. In this KERA documentary, it's really interesting because they not only filmed him playing, but they filmed him teaching. So he's teaching his studio class in some clips, and then this looks more like a pedagogy class because they're in a classroom there at SMU, and this is exactly how it was. So I'm gonna just play you this full clip from the documentary, and this is how it would go. He would be expressing to us, his students, things that he thought were most important. And I can never really tell if he wanted people to chime in with their comments or if he was just saying, this is the way that it is, and it's not up for discussion right now. If that was the case, I mean, rightfully so. But the thing is, with us being students and being very inexperienced and young people and all that kind of stuff, we have no idea what he is talking about. And if you watch this documentary, you will see he's very different. I mean, listen to what he says when they ask him about the history of the guitar. Most people would say, well, the vihuela and then the lute, which is incorrect, but most people say that anyway. And then the Baroque guitar and then the Torres or whatever. Listen to what he says. His answer is extremely different. I mean, he just comes from left field. That's who he was. He was very different. So he would say these amazing, like mind-blowing theoretical things, and then he would just kind of look around the room, and we would all just be looking at each other with blank faces like, what are we supposed to say? I mean, does he want us to say, yes, absolutely, that's what we should do? Or does he want us to say, well, that doesn't make any sense? Or, I mean, does he want us to come up with a different opinion? Who knows? So when I saw this clip of this same effect happening all those years ago, I just laughed so hard because they show this shot and you see everybody's face and their faces are just like, what the hell is he talking about? And I thought, I understand exactly how y'all feel. And it was exactly the same when I was in his program, 30 or 40 years later, something like that. So check out this shot, and I'll leave you with this to wrap up this technique analysis video.
I would say everything that you can say about a musical performance in detail, everything that you can agree on about phrasing, style, articulation, ornamentation, all of those things are very much external. They're superficial. I'm not saying they're unimportant. They're very much external. Everything about a musical interpretation that is spontaneous and creative is internal. Now those two feed each other, but you can't get to one from the other. You buy that?